So nice to have you back, Dmitry, on this
Good,
podcast.
good to be with you.
And let's get started with what's going on right now between Russia and NATO. In U- Ukraine, they're talking about giving some sort of permission to Ukraine to hit deep into the Russian territory. It seems that the Zelensky administration didn't get the permission yet. But what would be the reaction on the part of Russia considering what Putin said recently?
Well, first of all, the Ukraine got the permission to do that a long time ago and has been hitting Russia with long-range weapons for a really long time. Secondly, it wasn't the Ukraine doing this, it was NATO and specifically Americans, because the Ukraine has no capacity to program these long-range weapons itself. So it was NATO crews operating the equipment. So this is really about nothing. This is a distraction. This is not what Zelensky and Blinken and Lemmy talked about in the Ukraine at all. It's just sort of a cover story, something to discuss. And the idea is to say something and provoke a reaction from the Russians and have people talk about that as opposed to what's actually going on. Now, to basically wrap up the story about these long-range weapons. First of all, there are very few ATACMS left, very few, less than 100 total. Secondly, the Russians know how to intercept them extremely well. They launched a dozen of them at the Kerch Bridge in Crimea. All of them were intercepted. Traffic was stopped for maybe an hour, maybe a little bit more, and then resumed across the bridge. So it was a non-event. And similarly, other such attacks will be a non-event. There's talk of the Germans providing their long-range weapons, but these have to be launched from jets that don't exist in the Ukraine. So again, that's just a verbiage. It doesn't really matter. And in any case, everybody has understood by now that even if these weapons were all used against targets in Russia, this would not change the course of events. This would not prevent the Ukraine from being defeated, which it is in the process of doing. So this is just hot air. It means nothing. Now, what are they really discussing? Well, Lemmy was there. I bet he was bitterly complaining about the fact that the commercial paper, the obligations that the British Crown has purchased, the Ukrainian funny paper that has been purchased, is now worthless. And this basically makes the UK Treasury look very bad, look kind of broke. And I'm sure that they're upset about that. I'm sure they're upset about the number of quote unquote mercenaries, but really military personnel from the UK and from the US, among other countries, getting killed in Kursk. They're pulling out the dead and the wounded if they're foreigners. They're leaving the dead and wounded Ukrainians to just lay there and die. They're being killed in droves by the Russians as the Russians advance. So I'm sure they're not happy about that. They're probably not happy about the fact that the Ukrainians are probably by now thinking about pulling out of Kursk because what they're doing there is absolutely futile. They're burning up their last remaining reserves in something that is just a complete waste. I bet they're not happy about the front in the east collapsing, and very concerned that it could actually collapse prior to the elections in the United States, making Kamala Harris, who is the inheritor of the Biden regime, look really bad, look pathetic. And so those are all subjects of great grave concern to both Lemmy and to Blinken, and probably the reason they went to Kiev, and not some kind of a phantom permission to do what they themselves have been doing, because it's NATO crews that are arming these rocket systems, these weapons. It's not the Ukrainians doing it. Now, in terms of the Russian reaction, what Putin said was that Russia would respond adequately to this provocation, that it's actually NATO attacking Russia, and that these are terrorist attacks on Russian territory. Now, in terms of what Russia can do, Russia can turn the lights off in the United States by refusing to sell enriched uranium to the United States. Russia can completely hamstring the oil industry in the United States by refusing to sell heavy crude to the United States. These are all subjects of consideration right now in Russia. Lists are being compiled, and people are busy calculating how quickly such measures will take effect and how severe the effects will be. Will it be enough to just scare the Americans, or will they actually have to follow through on the threat? Now, heavy crude doesn't seem like such a big problem, except that there are very few places in the world where it's available. Venezuela is one, but things didn't go well between the United States and Venezuela, to put it mildly. But with Russia, Russia has been selling its crude to the United States in spite of everything else that's going on. And the problem is that the United States has lots of shale oil, which is light oil and is useless for making anything other than gasoline and plastics and various other things. It's useless for making diesel or jet fuel or bunker fuel or other types of heavy oil and distillates without mixing it with heavy crude. So if the Americans don't get their heavy crude, their refineries that are producing diesel and other distillates will have to shut down, and then truck traffic in the United States will shut down, and shipping will shut down, etc., which would be a very, very big problem. Enriched uranium is a similar issue. Russia enriches half the uranium on the planet. Americans have forgotten or have never figured out how to do it. They're using French technology, which cannot be scaled up. The French have some enriching capacity that also can't be scaled up. And so it's really Russia or nothing. And the United States has 100 nuclear power plants that require Russian enriched uranium. And if they shut down, then basically a quarter of electricity generation in the United States goes away. So those are very sensitive things to the United States, much more sensitive than some phantom rocket hits that the Russians will probably intercept anyway. And so that is how Russia will respond. It will respond by shutting America down, not by attacking it with weapons.
Yeah. I got your mic fixed here because I was checking the setting. It was all sort of noise coming in, and I was checking your mic here, and it was in the setting there is a echo cancellation that yeah, I just canceled that part, and just it seems that the problem with your voice is gone right now.
Oh, echo
And
cancellation was turned on?
yeah, no,
Oh, that's a problem.
it was on. I turned it off.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
No echo
Right
cancellation.
right now everything's fine. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Finally.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the story with the long range weapons, such as they are.
Okay. And Dimitri, let's talk about the way that Putin was talking about the response. He said that Ukrainians are not capable to hit the Russian soil without help coming from the European Union and together with the United States, NATO. And it shows he's sending some sort of message to the West. If Ukrainians, any sort of missiles coming into the Russian territory, we're going to respond to you. But when he said that we're going to respond, how would that be? And in your opinion, to what extent he's going to respond to this sort of attack if that happens?
Oh, he won't respond directly to the attack. The Russians will respond to the attack by shooting down the missiles. The ATACMS they can shoot down pretty much 100%. 12 out of 12 they shot down. Other recent attacks, they actually got the missiles to run out of fuel, drop down to the ground, and they basically took the missiles and took them away as trophies to dismantle and study. There was one apartment building that got hit, and one woman died. This is nothing. This is not World War. This is just some criminal activity on the part of NATO. So NATO, in its desperation, is resorting to these terrorist measures, but they're ineffectual terrorist measures. All they're doing is they're making Russian men extremely mad. If I were an oil painter, I would paint a big painting of a Russian man in military uniform trying to go and fight, and his wife and children and maybe a dog restraining him and forcing him to stay home, because that's the situation that's unfolding in a lot of households in Russia right now. After Kursk and after these terrorist attacks by NATO, after hearing that these are terrorist attacks and that they're by NATO, they really want to go and kick some ass, the Russians. So until now, there were maybe 2,500 Russians volunteering for military service a day. That number is likely to go up. So Russia will have absolutely no shortage of men willing to fight. Now, in terms of an overall reaction, yes, what Putin said during a cabinet meeting, which was the beginning of each cabinet meeting, tends to be broadcast live on television. And I saw that part of it, and it was broadcast later on the nightly news. Putin sort of mused, and he said, well, Russia is very rich in natural resources, rich in oil, natural gas, titanium, gold, diamonds, and he went down the entire list, nickel. These are all strategic materials. And why are we selling them to our enemies, who then come around and attack us and stage terrorist attacks against our people? Why are we doing that? He mused. And then he turned to Mishustin and the prime minister, and he said, could you look into it and maybe compile a list of things, exports we could limit or block to various certain hostile countries? And Mishustin said, aye, sir. So that's happening. That's happening. And that's going to be the response. And like I said, what Putin will do in response to these terrorist attacks, which are basically fundamentally being staged not by the Ukrainians, but by NATO people stationed on Ukrainian soil together with those weapons, using data from American satellites, using data from American surveillance aircraft, and programmed by Americans. So the Russian response will be for that to shut down economically the countries, just like Europe has been or partially shut down by the destruction of Nord Stream and the limitations on the export of natural gas and oil. This is going to be much more severe. A lot of industry in the West and in the United States is going to go bye-bye as a result of this. And once Americans realize that Russia, and coupled with China and coupled with Iran, can pretty much shut down their economies, and then there won't really be an issue, a military issue anymore. I think once they realize that, then that will be a response, because people in positions of power in the West tend to be kind of numb. shooting them in the head doesn't seem to work. You have to shoot them in the wallet. That's the only part of their system that has nerve endings in it, is the wallet. You have to hurt them financially, and then they understand. And I think that is what Putin has planned.
Yeah. The other thing, Dimitri, right now would be, why do they need this sort of escalation that they're talking about in the West? And is this the outcome of the failure in the Kursk region? Is this uh, one of the reasons of the main reason would be what's going on in the United States or what's going on in the European Union in terms of what politically what's going on in Germany and France? How do you see this, and why do they need to escalate? Because these type of talks, we had a meeting between CIA and MI6, a public meeting, not it wasn't a secret meeting. That's why we know about it. And they're trying to send a political message to Russia. And after that, Antony Blinken and Lemmy visiting Ukraine. And how do you see this? Why do they need this sort of escalation?
Oh, it's not an escalation. This has been going on the entire time. There's nothing new happening. It's just words. Okay, it's just an exchange of words, except that Russia will finally react. That is the new element. So if anyone is going to escalate, it's Russia. Russia is going to limit exports of strategic materials to hostile countries, and that will hurt those countries economically and make them think again about supporting the Ukraine. That will be the outcome. Now, in terms of them discussing allowing or not allowing the Ukrainians, quote unquote, meaning themselves, to strike deep into Russian territory using rockets that the Russians know how to intercept, okay, that is so that they do not have to publicly discuss the failure in Kursk, the failure in the Donbass, the bankruptcy of the Ukraine, the fact that the Ukrainian government is falling apart, the fact that the recruiting effort in the Ukraine, trying to get more cannon fodder into the ranks of the military, has failed and is failing. All of those nasty things that they don't want to talk about, they're covering up with this appearance of judiciously discussing whether or not to allow themselves to launch terrorist attacks against Russia. And it may seem ridiculous, but what else can they do? Every other thing that they might actually talk about is worse.
And when it comes to Ukraine, who's in charge in Ukraine, Dimitri? Is Zelensky? Is the far right
The Americans
nationalist?
are in charge in Ukraine. The Americans, the CIA, some State Department operatives.
They're totally dominant in Ukraine, or you consider some sort of leverage these far right nationalists having on Washington?
It's basically the Americans trying to get the Ukrainians to do what they want them to do without stealing too much money, and that's never working out really well. So what we have now going on in Kiev is rats abandoning a sinking ship, and the way the rats have to abandon the sinking ship is they have to accumulate, or steal actually, enough money to buy their way out, and then their lieutenants or somebody else from further down the ranks gets into the position of authority, hoping that there's something else left to steal for them to also accumulate enough money to buy their way out, because they don't want to be stuck in Kiev when the whole thing collapses, and it's going to collapse. So that is really what's going on. The Americans have this idea of what they want to do. The Europeans basically do whatever the Americans tell them to do. The Ukrainians sort of pretend to be doing what the Americans tell them to do, but what they're really interested in is stealing all the money that remains, maybe selling some weapons on the black market as they've been doing. So that's that's the level of ongoing activity there, and saying that, well, there's politics going on in the Ukraine. Well, no, there's no politics. It's just a dictatorial regime, which is a puppet regime, and which is being managed very much micromanaged by the United States.
And when would be that moment of collapse in your opinion? It would be economically because of not receiving any sort of aid from the West. It would be some sort of military defeat on the battlefield, a decisive one, or it could be a combination of both. Because right now it doesn't seem that the Biden administration is willing to cut any sort of aid that is already, they're already sending aid to Ukraine. They're sending money. Sweden was sending, the United States, they're talking about long range missiles, not yet, but drones, everything, ammunition. But when, in your opinion, when would be that moment that Zelensky administration cannot operate anymore?
Oh, when Zelensky either gets killed or leaves the country. That's how we know that it's over. And nobody can tell when that's going to happen, because the Russians are doing what the Russians are doing. They're not asking anyone's permission, and they're not on any particular schedule. So they're moving towards the Dnieper River in Donetsk. They're slowly taking over parts of Kharkiv region. They've crossed the Dnieper River in Kherson in 2 places. And probably the idea is to get Kherson, the city of Kherson, which is on the right bank of the Dnieper, to get that back, because they retreated from it way back in 2022 to construct the defensive line, the Surovikin line, which the Ukrainians then destroyed themselves against for an entire season. But now they want to get Kherson back. And then there's the action in Kursk. So the Russians are waiting for the Ukrainians to stop sending fresh troops into Kursk for them to kill. So why would the Russians interfere with that beautiful effort of the Ukrainians to completely deplete their military, of just drain it of all blood? But a moment will arrive when the Ukrainians no longer have anyone to send into Kursk. And then it will turn out that there are enough Russian troops and materiel accumulated on the border of Sumy region, which is on the other side of the border from Kursk, for the Russians to basically go into Sumy region and take it over. So then we're talking about everything going over to the Russian side, up to Kiev region. So Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, Lugansk, Kharkiv, Sumy will all be Russian. And then there's the question as to what to do with the Kiev region and the Odessa region. Nikolaev is sort of in the middle. That would probably be taken over pretty quickly. All Russian speaking, all historically Russian. Are they going to be part of Russia as well? And then we can talk about what to do with Dnipropetrovsk, which is on the other side of Dnieper. And so that's kind of like the medium range Russian plan as I see it. No negotiations. There's nobody to negotiate with. The idea of negotiating with the Ukrainians is completely ridiculous. And there is no reason to negotiate with Americans, because who the hell are Americans and what the hell are they doing there? They belong on the other side of the world. So that's how I see it.
And how did you find the debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump in terms of what's going on in Ukraine?
Oh, I definitely didn't watch that. God forbid. First of all, these are not debates. This is just ridiculous. And secondly, it was 3 against 1. It was Kamala and the two moderators against one Trump, and so it was just absolutely completely ridiculous. And then Kamala probably just repeated things that she heard in her fancy earrings that were broadcasting messages into her brain, because she's not really capable of being that together and actually coming up with anything. Maybe she memorized a few lines. But and Trump was just Trump. But it's all ridiculous. You see, it would have been a debate if it were a debate, which it wasn't. But it would have been a debate between a friend of Putin and a Putin agent, because that's what they're calling each other, which is hilarious. But poor Americans, they still, a lot of them haven't realized that they don't live in a democracy, and they're racking their brains as to who to vote against. And in the meantime, they've been split into 2 different countries with two completely different mindsets, and will probably end up fighting each other in a civil war before too long.
It was so amazing to see, because when it comes to Ukraine and what's going on in Ukraine, the fight was who's receiving the support from Putin the most, the most. And Kamala was, Donald Trump was saying that Putin is supporting Kamala. And when it came to Israel, both of them just were competing that I'm supportive of Israel. That I'm the most unbelievable what was going on in that debate. And how right now, Dmitry, do you think that, because recently we had an interview that JD Vance was talking about, if Trump wins, what they're going to do in terms of what's going on in Ukraine. I'm going to play the clip that he's talking about these things.
Ukraine wants this war to end. Europe, which, by the way, has underfunded this war while American taxpayers have been very generous to the Ukrainians, the Europeans want this war to end because it's jacking up their energy prices. So I think what this looks like is Trump sits down, he says to the Russians, the Ukrainians, the Europeans, you guys need to figure out, what does a peaceful settlement look like? And what it probably looks like is something like the current line of demarcation between Russia and Ukraine. That becomes like a demilitarized zone. It's heavily fortified so the Russians don't invade again. Ukraine remains its independent sovereignty. Russia gets the guarantee of neutrality from Ukraine. It doesn't join NATO. It doesn't join, some of these sort of allied institutions. And I think that's ultimately what this looks like. And by the way, the Germans and other countries have to fund some Ukrainian reconstruction.
How much of what he has said is in line with what Russia wants in this, to put an end to this conflict?
None. Basically, what he said is, it's like this, right? And the Russians are over on this side and the Ukrainians over on this side. And when we keep the Russians from going from one side to the other, and then we give the Russians some guarantees, because you see, we're so believable and the Russians believe us because we keep all of our promises and we're so authoritative, right? And then we'll also tell the Europeans what to do, because the Europeans will, of course, rebuild the Ukraine. For what exactly? For what purpose? So he's
he was talking about Germany.
Germany, yeah, Germany, whose budget is basically a black hole at this point, is going to rebuild the Ukraine. He is from another planet. This guy. I mean, if you took him seriously, which I don't, he's just some American politician. But if I took him seriously, I would say that he's from a different planet. This has nothing to do with with what the Russians want. First of all, the Russians will probably claim all of what's theirs, which is all of the Ukraine except for the westernmost portion, which hasn't been part of Russia pretty much ever. It was part of Austria-Hungary. And the Russians have no reason to claim it as theirs. It is of no strategic advantage to Russia, and it's peopled by people who are not Russian. And so the Russians have really no claim on it. But the rest of the Ukraine will become part of Russia again. And because it was part of the Russian Empire, it was settled by Russians, etc. And in the meantime, what they have to do is demilitarize the whole area, denazify the whole area. All the people who committed war crimes have to be dealt with. Russia will probably lift the moratorium on death penalty and do the traditional thing and hang them all after giving a trial. And what this has to do with the United States, well, it has to do with convincing the United States that this is all too rich for their blood and they should go home. The Americans should just go home. This is not their fight. They have nothing to do with it. They have nothing to gain, and they have a lot to lose. Look at what happened to Boeing, just because Boeing no longer can buy Russian titanium parts. Boeing is on its last legs at this point just because of that. Well, not just because of that, also because it was managed by a bean counter instead of an engineer. That had something to do with it. But basically, you have to realize that, that there's a learning process for the Americans, and that learning process involves realizing that there's nothing positive they can do in this situation except leave. Stop supporting the Ukraine and just stop talking about it. Do what they usually do, which is pretend that it doesn't exist, like they did with Afghanistan, like they did with Iraq, like they did with Libya, etc.
Can we hope some sort of changes in Germany right now with the rise of AfD and the left-wing party? They're against the policy in Ukraine.
I think this is more of an internal German subject that doesn't really have anything to do with the Ukraine. The problem for Germany and for much of the rest of Europe is that the people in Brussels, the European Commission, I believe, estimated that somewhere between 3 and 5 million Ukrainians will cross the border into the European Union once the Kiev regime collapses, because they're really not looking forward to meeting the Russians. And there are quite a few categories of people who the Russians do not regard as particularly friendly and have nothing to gain and a lot to lose from such an encounter. And they will all leave. So Europe will have to somehow accommodate between 3 and 5 million more people from the Ukraine. And these are people who are a little bit allergic to work and feel entitled, and will probably feel that the Europeans have unjustly abandoned them in their valiant struggle against the Kremlin and the dread dictator Putin, and will in some way take their revenge, perhaps by being passive aggressive on the Europeans for doing so. That is going to be a big problem politically. But in terms of what the election in Germany is going to do, no matter who the Germans vote for, it's a US occupied country. It does not have sovereignty. Its government has two choices: do what the Americans tell them to do, or get out, resign, and be replaced.
How much of what has been destroyed between the European Union in terms of the relationship between the European Union and Russia is reversible, in your opinion, if we get some sort of political settlement at the end of the day?
Well, first of all, political settlement with whom? Political settlement between Russia and Russia? Because that's what the whole thing with the Ukraine is going to involve. Now, in terms of these countries that are now on the list of hostile nations as far as Russia is concerned, Russia has issues with their governments, which are hostile to one extent or another. Hungary and Slovakia less so, for instance. Um, and you know, it varies from country to country, and the idea of the idea of bilateral relations is not altogether dead, but there will be certainly no effort made to somehow patch things up between Russia and the European Union as a whole. Russia will pretty much wait for it to die, I think. And the other thing to understand, which is very important, is that Russia has no issues with the peoples of all of these European countries, or the United States for that matter. The problem is with the governments and the politicians, not the people. And there's a new list being compiled of countries that are hostile in terms of their ideology of extreme neoliberalism, and that oppose Russia's traditional values, religious and moral values. And that makes it possible for people from these countries to gain admittance to Russia. They basically go to the Russian consulate and fill out paperwork and are granted a 3-month private visa, go to Russia and get a 3-year temporary residency permit, which gives them 3 years to apply for permanent residency. A little less than 3 years, because they have to apply before their temporary residency expires. And so we should expect a flood of people from Europe, and maybe less of a flood, but a substantial number of people from the United States abandoning Europe and the United States and moving to Russia, which has been something that has happened throughout during various times of history. For instance, during the 17th and the 18th century, given everything that's been happening in Europe, around 1,000 people from Europe were arriving in Russia per day. There were entire huge settlements along the Volga that were all German-speaking, peopled by Germans, just as an example. And I believe that that's going to happen again, because Russia is rich and prosperous and has lots of resources, lots of free land, and not so many people. So this is basically Russia hanging out the welcome sign to all of Europe. Abandon this place that's full of refugees and hostile towards you with its postmodernist culture, and come to Russia and, you know, make babies and farm and do whatever you want.
And here is an article in Politico. This is the former European Central Bank President Mario Draghi. He's talking about the problems in the European Union in terms of their economy. And here is what he said.
Been slowing down for a long time in Europe, but we've ignored it. Until 2 years ago, we would never have such a conversation as the one we're having today, because things were sort of going well. We were doing well out of globalization. Unemployment was steadily falling. But now we cannot ignore it any longer. We've lost our main supplier of cheap energy, Russia. And now we have to start for our defense again for the first time since the Second World War. At the same time, this is the first year when Europe cannot count on population growth for its increase. And population is set to decline steadily, so much that by 2040, there will be 2 million workers disappearing from the labor market every year. Productivity is weak, it's very weak. So if we were to maintain our current average productivity of the last 10 years, say, it would only be enough to keep GDP constant until 2050. The investment share will have to rise by around 5 percentage points of GDP to levels last seen in the 60s and the 70s. And if Europe can no longer provide them to its people, it will have lost its reason for being.
Yeah. How did you find his points?
Oh, it's absolutely wonderful, poetic for a banker to actually spell things out this way in terms of numbers. And he's right, but I think he underestimates the problem. I think that what Europe is going through is a native population collapse. And he's a banker, so all he does is look at numbers. He doesn't see the people behind the numbers so much. But the new arrivals do not in any way equate to the people who've been living there for centuries, who have passed on traditions sometimes for many generations within families. And so that population, the native population, is dying out because of very low fertility rates, having to do with a lot of factors that we could probably spend another hour discussing. But basically, fertility rates of under 2 point something children per woman means that with each next cohort becomes smaller and smaller, shrinks. Eventually, you get a population of elderly people who do not reproduce and who are past retirement age, so their productivity is zero or very close to it. And then you have an influx of people from, in many ways, incompatible cultures who cannot readily contribute to this very complex European society that has existed until now. All they can do really is menial labor and live on government handouts, which the government may not be able to provide. So Europe will pretty much disappear as the many countries in Europe will pretty much disappear, will have run their course. There will be population replacement. There will be a bit of a dark age. And then something else will emerge, like a European caliphate, for instance, an Islamic European caliphate, which is not really unprecedented. There was a caliphate in Spain that was driven out, but it may come back. And this time it may make it quite a bit further north than that. So I think that Draghi is he's right to sound an alarm, but he's wrong that something could be done about it. The numbers that he mentions, he says that the infusions of new capital, the new investments to shore up the situation, be similar to what happened after World War II. He means the Marshall Plan, most likely. Except what he's talking about is 2 or 3 times larger than the Marshall Plan, which was maybe 1% of GDP, maybe 1.5. He's talking about 3-4%, something like that. There is no source for that money. That capital does not exist. It's not going to happen. And that's the part that he is not saying, because he still has to somehow give people hope. Although hope is really bad. Hope is bad for you. Abandoning hope is a very healthy thing to do in a situation like that.
It seems that he mentions that the main reason is the Russian energy coming to the European Union. But when he comes to the conclusion, he doesn't mention that would be a solution, that we can get back and we can reconnect with Russia in terms of the energy. Do you understand how they're going to solve it without Russia? Because it doesn't seem that any other country is capable of doing this.
Well, look, Russia a little while ago, about half of the federal revenue of the federal government came from natural gas and oil exports. Now it's down to a third, and the quantity is even lower because the prices have gone up. And Russia has uses for that energy domestically because the Russian economy is growing. And once there was this problem with Europe, Russia decided to change the flows of energy from west to east, and will continue to do so because uh, uh, the Pacific Rim and nations in the global south are far more friendly toward Russia and are growing dynamically and don't have this problem that Draghi is talking about. So Russia would be foolish to restart its trade with a part of the world that is clearly failing and is antagonistic towards Russia, whereas it can do so much better by trading with countries that are friendly and prosperous and growing and developing economically. I don't see any future energy flow, particularly large energy flow, going from Russia to Western Europe because there's nothing for Russia in it. There's really very little that Russia still wants from Europe in exchange for that. And so I don't see that as very likely. Now, there's another thing brewing, which is the shale oil bonanza in the United States is going to run its course. It's on a plateau now. It's shale oil and shale gas have stopped growing. They're on a plateau, and the physical specifics of shale are such that to maintain a plateau, you have to constantly accelerate the drilling rate overall. And so the thing that needs to be understood is the drilling rate cannot accelerate forever. There's a physical limit there as well. So at some point, the United States will stop being the largest oil producer in the world and will go back to a situation where it is forced to import huge quantities of oil, 10 million barrels a day. And there's absolutely no place for that oil to come from. There's no replacement for shale oil because shale oil is what has compensated in the past decade or so, for a little less than a decade, for global oil depletion, which has been ongoing. And that will make the situation in Europe and in the United States much worse because nobody, not Saudi Arabia, which is selling oil to China, not Russia, which is selling everything to Eastern countries and just a little bit still to Europe. Nobody can jump into that breach and supply that missing energy.
Yeah. And when it comes to the Middle East, you have a very important country. It's called Turkey right now. Before it was Turkey, and right now Turkey. But how do you see their policy right now? Do you think they're finally getting to the point that they know they're going to play with Russia and China and BRICS, or they want to stay with the United States and NATO? Because this is a huge decision on their part. But from their behavior, can we understand what they're aiming at right now?
Well, it's the typical Turkish thing where they are tricky and they can't be trusted. So they want to be part of BRICS, and at the same time, they have not completely disowned NATO. So how can a NATO country be a member of BRICS? That seems like a very nasty problem of split loyalty. So they applied to BRICS, and BRICS as an organization is all about, discussing things, talking, looking for compromise, etc. Nobody's going to say, no, Turkey, you have to make up your mind or you're not allowed in. What has actually happened is BRICS has grown to 10 members. There are lots of other countries that want to get in, but the 10 members have put the brakes on new entrants, and Turkey is one of those new entrants. So Turkey can go on wanting to be part of BRICS, and it can go on being part of NATO, and nothing will continue happening for quite a while until somebody makes some decision. And it can all be reasonably copacetic and nobody needs to be worried about it, but it doesn't mean anything because this is just people talking.
Yeah. And just to wrap up this session, Dmitry, right now it seems that the United States is sending some of their weapons to the Pacific, and because they were all in the Middle East. And do you think that they're right now they're not thinking of supporting, because with what's going on between Iran and Netanyahu, between Iran and Israel, it doesn't seem that Iran going to attack Israel anytime soon. And do you think that they're thinking that Iran is not going to attack Israel? That's why they're moving this equipment, these aircraft carriers to the Pacific?
Well, the aircraft carriers are safer in the Pacific because in the Middle East, somebody could actually sink them. Aircraft carriers are useless. There are now rockets all over the world, and many countries have them, that can destroy an aircraft carrier from a distance that aircraft carriers cannot reach using the aircraft on board without refueling, in-flight refueling. And so the Americans, they have a couple of aircraft carriers left, and so they have to somehow make some sort of use of them, sending them here and there. So they had them next to Yemen doing absolutely nothing useful, and now they're going to have them in the Pacific doing absolutely nothing useful. And the thing about Israel is dying. Its GDP is down 19% year on year. That is, for a small country, just a huge amount. The port of Eilat that was used to supply much of Israel via the Red Sea is bankrupt as of a couple of months ago, and it's not receiving or sending anything, and Israel is losing population, it's losing money, and it's losing militarily. So I'm not surprised that the Americans, and specifically the American establishment, given the fact that Netanyahu is not at all agreeable and is at this point, I think he's borderline persona non grata in the White House, not welcome there at all. I think that they just basically want to steam pointlessly Pacific instead of being cooped up in the Middle East where they could actually get hurt. The Yemenis managed to burn a hole in the flight deck of one of their precious aircraft carriers. They don't want that to happen again. So why not steam around like they did, when there was this sort of problem with North Korea. They sent an aircraft carrier there too, steaming around on random courses, and then it went home and nothing happened. And so this is just posturing, and it's also a recognition of the fact that nobody really has to do anything about Israel. Israel is just basically drying up and blowing away on its own. Israeli politics is such a horrible mess that nobody even wants to get close to it. And so why not just ignore the problem and wait for it to go away?
Yeah. Finally we got this noise fixed, Dmitry.
It was your fault. It was all your fault. Well, I'm glad
I
you got
was
it
during the talk. I was just I was in the setting, just turning on, turning off, turning on, turning off to keep the noise out of our discussion, because I don't know what's going on. Something is messy here, and something's wrong here. I don't know, but I was playing with the volume as well. I was playing with the echo cancellation just to keep these noises out of our discussion. But thank you so much for being with us today. Great pleasure as always, Dmitry.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.